With minutes left before his execution, a prisoner asks to see his dog, just one last time. But when the dog enters, he doesn't sit or lick his owner. He growls at a guard. What happens next halts the execution, exposes a buried crime, and shocks the entire nation. In cell 31, the sound was louder than ever. Because tonight, Ethan Ray was scheduled to die. He sat on the edge of his narrow cot, eyes fixed on the far corner of the concrete room. The sunset poured through the barred window, casting blood-orange shadows across the floor. He hadn't moved in hours. No pacing, no screaming, just silence. Calm. Too calm for a man who had exactly 60 minutes left to live. Outside the door, the guard spoke in hushed tones. "You ever seen one this quiet?" one asked. The other shook his head. "Not like this. Most of them cry or beg. He just waits." Ethan had already declined his last meal. No steak, no pie, just coffee. Black, bitter, familiar. They thought it was stoicism, but it wasn't. It was something else, something unspoken that still lingered in the air. Across the prison yard, preparations were underway. The warden signed the final authorization. The chaplain readied the prayer. The gurney had been tested 3 times. All was in order. Everything was routine until the warden received an unusual note. A handwritten request, submitted 2 days earlier, now sitting on his desk for the final time. "I'd like to see my dog, just once. His name is Max." The warden leaned back in his chair, frowning. "You're kidding me," he muttered. "A dog before execution?" In 20 years, he'd heard of last meals, songs, even requests for forgiveness. But never this. "Is the dog even alive?" he asked. Turns out he was. Max, a German shepherd, had been in the care of a rescue organization ever since Ethan's arrest. No family claimed him. No one came for him. He'd aged, grayed, and waited, just like his owner. Back in cell 31, Ethan finally blinked. He leaned forward, clasped his hands together, and exhaled long and slow. He didn't know if his request would be granted, but it was all he asked. Not freedom, not mercy, just the chance to look into the eyes of the only soul who'd ever loved him without question. Down the corridor, the execution team prepared. Medics checked vials, officers reviewed procedure, no delays, no complications, all by the book. But in the heart of it all sat a man who had once been a decorated firefighter. A man who had been found guilty of a crime he swore he didn't commit. And as the final hour ticked away, his request, a single moment with a dog, was about to shake the very foundation of everything Coldriver thought it knew about justice. Because some stories don't end when the clock runs out. Some stories are just waiting for the truth to bark its way in. 2 days before the execution, Ethan Ray sat alone with a prison counselor. A pen, a piece of lined paper, and a blank stare were all he'd been given. "You don't have to write anything," the counselor had said. "But if there's something, anything, you'd like to request for your final hour, now's the time." Ethan hadn't looked up. His hands were scarred, calloused, trembling slightly. But after a long, breathless pause, he wrote 7 words slowly across the page. "I'd like to see my dog, Max." That was it. No further explanation, no paragraph, just a name and a hope. The counselor raised an eyebrow. "Your dog?" Ethan nodded once. "He was with me that night, the night they said I did it. You know we don't usually allow animals?" "I'm not asking for a crowd," Ethan said quietly. "Just Max, for a minute." The request made its way through the system, filed, flagged, almost dismissed. It landed on Warden Brackett's desk with a red stamp across the top. Non-standard. The warden scoffed at first. "We run a prison, not a petting zoo," he muttered. But something about the request kept tugging at him. Maybe it was the handwriting, firm, deliberate, but clearly from someone who had nothing left. Or maybe it was the way the dog's name stood alone. Maximum, no last name, no fluff. Just Max. Warden Brackett called for the file. Ethan Ray, former firefighter, convicted arson murder. Life before that? Commendations, medals, 2 children, a wife who left after the trial, no appeals left. Execution set. Everything clean, legal, final. But there was a line buried in the arrest report that caught his eye. Suspect claims his dog attempted to alert him to fire and lead him from the building. The fire, the same one that killed Ethan's neighbor and child. The same blaze he was accused of starting. No camera footage, just circumstantial evidence and a matchbook found near Ethan's home. And Max, the dog that barked and bit one of the responding officers trying to reach the scene. The same Max that Ethan had raised since puppyhood. The same Max he refused to let be put down, even while facing trial. He didn't do anything wrong, Ethan had told the judge. All he did was try to save me. The warden leaned back in his chair and sighed. Find the dog? Calls were made, records pulled. And by some miracle of timing, Max had survived. Older now, grayer, still held in a local no-kill shelter under the name Maximus Ray. He was described as calm, loyal, and unnervingly intelligent. Permission was granted. Bring him in just before the execution window, the warden ordered. 1 visit, 10 minutes, no media. But no one, not even the warden, knew how much weight that visit would carry, because Ethan's request wasn't just for comfort, it was a key, and the door it would unlock hadn't been touched in years. Warden Samuel Brackett wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed. He had overseen 9 executions during his tenure, each carried out by the book, without error, without delay. To him, the law was a line, sharp, clear, and final. But ever since Ethan Ray's handwritten request landed on his desk, that line had begun to blur. The file sat open before him. Ethan Ray, former fire captain, model citizen, turned convict. The crime, arson and double homicide. The evidence, thin but technically admissible. And the verdict, guilty, unanimously. But then there was Max. Brackett rubbed his temples. It wasn't the dog that haunted him. It was the story behind him. A story about a house fire in the dead of night, a missing call log, and a dog that wouldn't stop barking long after the flames had been extinguished. According to initial reports, Max had clawed at the door, tried to pull Ethan away from the garage where the fire started. He'd even attempted to drag a neighbor from the smoke, something most dogs wouldn't instinctively do. That wasn't a pet, that was a partner. Now, Ethan sat in his cell awaiting death, and all he wanted, his final wish, was to see the very dog who, in his words, had witnessed everything. Brackett didn't like emotion clouding protocol. But this wasn't just emotion. This was evidence. Or at least, it felt like it could be. Why would a man guilty of murder want to see the one creature that had been with him during the crime? He picked up the prison phone and called legal. Any precedent on fulfilling a condemned man's wish to see a dog before execution? The lawyer on the other end paused. Not a standard request, she admitted. But technically, the warden has full discretion within reason. If it's not a threat to safety or security, then I can say yes. You can, but you'd better be sure. Media will find out. Brackett hung up and walked to the window. The sky outside had dimmed. In 4 hours, Ethan Ray would be dead. And this dog, Max, was being transported to the facility under strict security. The warden paced. Could a dog really change anything? Could a last-minute reunion possibly matter? He turned back toward the cell block reports. A guard knocked lightly on the door. "Sir, the transport team has arrived. The dog is here." Brackett didn't answer at first. Then, finally, set up a visitation room. 1 chair, 1 handler, no restraints on the dog. If something's going to happen, let it happen real. He sat back down at his desk and stared at Ethan's request one more time. "I'd like to see my dog, Max." It sounded simple, innocent. But in his gut, the warden knew. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was a challenge to everything they thought they knew about guilt, loyalty, and truth. The corridor to the visitation chamber was long, quiet, and painted a dull institutional green, the same color prisoners had whispered about for decades. They called it the Green Mile, the final stretch before the execution chamber. But today, it led to something else, a room holding a single chair, a single dog, and the last request of a man whose fate seemed sealed. Ethan Ray stood at the threshold of his cell, shackles secured around his wrists and ankles. 2 guards flanked him, silent, grim-faced. One gave the nod, and the door creaked open. "You ready?" the taller one asked. Ethan didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, chains rattling slightly with each step. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, not on the floor, not on the guards, on something else, something waiting. As he walked, memories rose like smoke. He saw Max as a puppy, chasing a tennis ball across the firehouse yard. He remembered the night Max woke him by pawing at his chest, seconds before the fire alarm even triggered. And he remembered the night that changed everything. The roar of flames, the smell of gasoline, the screams, the moment the door slammed shut and never opened again. The trial had come fast, too fast. Witnesses turned cold, alibis blurred. Prosecutors painted Ethan as a desperate man, drowning in debt, angry at a neighbor over a zoning complaint. And Max? They never let him testify, because dogs couldn't speak. But Ethan remembered, and now, with 1 hour left to live, he would see the only soul who still knew the full truth. The guards turned left at the end of the hallway and opened a door with reinforced glass. Inside was a plain room, pale green walls, a folding table against the far wall, and in the center, a wooden chair. But Ethan didn't look at the chair. His eyes locked on the figure lying patiently on the floor beside it. Maximum. The German shepherd's ears twitched before he even looked up. His head lifted, eyes sharpening. Then he stood, slowly, stiffly. He was older now. Gray streaks ran through his muzzle. His back leg had a slight tremble. But the moment he saw Ethan, he didn't hesitate. He barked once, not loud, not wild, but filled with something ancient. Recognition. Memory. The handler loosened his leash. "Go," she whispered. Max walked forward. Ethan didn't say a word. He dropped to his knees as far as the shackles allowed, his eyes filled with tears. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. Max closed the space between them and pressed his forehead to Ethan's chest, letting out a low, trembling whine that seemed to say everything words never could. The room fell silent. The guards watched in disbelief, because in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. And Max was about to speak in the only language he knew, loyalty. When Max had first arrived at the shelter, he didn't eat for 3 days. The staff thought it was trauma. After all, the dog had been taken from a fire scene, his fur singed, his paws raw from trying to claw through a metal door. His owner, Ethan Ray, had been arrested on the spot. And no one came to claim the dog. Not family, not friends, just silence. Max was labeled unplaceable, too attached, too still. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He just stared at the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it and prove the whole thing had been a mistake. But that door never opened. For months, he remained in the back corner kennel of the Coldridge County Animal Shelter. Volunteers tried everything, treats, toys, walks, but Max wouldn't budge unless it was nighttime. That's when he'd rise quietly and patrol the fence line. One staffer swore she saw him sit perfectly still, facing the highway for hours, his ears twitching at every car that passed. Still, no one adopted him. Until one rainy Thursday, a woman from the local K9 Rescue Foundation visited the shelter. Her name was Margaret. She specialized in retired service dogs and hard case rescues. The moment she walked past Max's kennel, he stood up and stared at her. Not with desperation, but with purpose. "He's alert," she said. "Not broken, just waiting." She took him home that day. Margaret began to work with him, gently, without pressure. Max was well trained, obedient. He responded to commands with military precision. And over time, she noticed something remarkable. Max didn't just respond, he understood. If a gate creaked at night, he'd wake her before the security camera blinked. If a neighbor's car pulled up and something felt off, he'd press against the window until the doorbell rang. This wasn't an average dog. He was guarding something. She pulled his records. That's when she saw the name, Maximus Ray, listed as property of Ethan Ray, former firefighter. Inmate number 227590. Sentenced to death. Margaret remembered the case, the fire, the child, the headlines. But what caught her attention wasn't the crime, it was the behavior. Max hadn't just survived the blaze, he had actively tried to stop it. Bite marks on the locked garage door, singed fur on his snout. The report even mentioned the dog attacking a first responder, not out of aggression, but panic. He had been trying to lead them somewhere. For 2 years, Max waited quietly in Margaret's home. But the day the call came from Cold River Penitentiary, asking if she still had the dog named Max, He stood up from his bed before she even finished the sentence. Tail rigid, ears forward, as if he'd been summoned. Margaret didn't hesitate. She made one call, loaded Max into the van, and said only 4 words. "Let's go find him." And as they drove into the fading sun, Max rested his head on the window, his eyes fixed not on where they were, but where he knew they needed to be. Inside the visitation room, the world seemed to slow. Ethan sat motionless, barely breathing, as Max approached. The chains on his wrists rattled faintly with each heartbeat, but otherwise, he was still. His eyes fixed on the dog who had once slept beside him every night, the one who'd run headfirst into smoke and flames and never turned back. Max didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stepped forward with steady, deliberate steps. He sniffed Ethan's palms, then his knees. Then, without hesitation, he rose up gently, placing his front paws on Ethan's lap and pressing his head into the man's chest. Ethan closed his eyes and let the tears come. Neither man nor dog made a sound, but that silence said everything. Years of separation, of unanswered questions, of trial transcripts that had erased context and courtroom walls that had kept the only witness locked outside. But now, here in this room, time folded in on itself. They were just 2 survivors who had finally found each other again. Max didn't move. His eyes were open, locked on Ethan's face, as if searching for something. Ethan reached up slowly, brushing his fingers over Max's ears. "You didn't forget me," he whispered, voice cracking. "Not even after all this time." The guard stood back, unsure whether to speak. Even the handler, Margaret, was speechless. In all her years rescuing K9s, she had never seen a reunion like this. There was no tail chasing, no frantic licking, no chaos, just presence. As if both man and dog had known this moment was coming. As if they had been carrying it quietly, all these years. Ethan leaned down and pressed his forehead to Max's. "I thought they took everything," he said, "but they didn't take you." Then something strange happened. Max stepped back slightly, sat down on the cold tile, and let out a deep, low growl. Not threatening, not angry, but steady. His eyes shifted, to the guards, then the door, then the far corner of the room. The handler noticed it first. "He's sensing something," Margaret said, stepping closer. Ethan followed Max's gaze. "He used to do that when someone was lying," he muttered. "He could read people, especially when they were hiding something." Max stood again, turned in a slow circle, then placed himself squarely between Ethan and the door. He barked once, short, sharp, precise. Everyone in the room jumped. "Is something wrong?" one of the guards asked. Margaret crouched beside the dog, checking his posture. "No," she said slowly. "Something's right. He recognizes something here. A scent." A memory. Ethan looked around the room, confusion settling into his face. "He smells something," he whispered. "Something from the night of the fire." The clock ticked louder now. Time was bleeding away. But Max had just opened a door no one expected. One not made of concrete or steel, but memory. And what came through next would upend everything. Max didn't just bark again, he fixated. His body stiffened, head low, tail frozen midair like a pointer. His gaze locked onto a guard at the far end of the visitation room. The man shifted uneasily. "What's wrong with the dog?" he muttered, stepping back a pace. But Max advanced, slow and deliberate, sniffing the air with mechanical precision. Ethan watched, stunned. "He knows something," he whispered. "That's his alert stance." The guard, a stocky man with thinning hair and a nervous twitch, scoffed. "It's just a dog, probably spooked by my cologne." But Margaret didn't think so. She had trained dozens of dogs in law enforcement and military settings. She recognized the difference between fear and fixation. Max wasn't afraid, he was identifying. "He's not reacting randomly," she said quietly. "He smells something familiar on you." The guard shifted again. "I've never seen that dog in my life." Max barked sharply, just once, and moved forward. He wasn't aggressive, he didn't lunge. He stood 2 feet from the guard, lifted his nose, and let out a deep, guttural whine, a sound of sorrow and warning. Ethan slowly stood, shackles clinking. "He did this once before," he said. "The night of the fire. He tried to stop someone in the garage, someone I never saw because I passed out from smoke." Margaret looked between Ethan and the trembling guard. Max just picked up a scent that matches that night. The warden was summoned. Within minutes, the visitation room had become a command center. A second team of officers arrived. Cameras were brought in. Max remained steady, eyes locked on the same man, Officer Rendell. He was newer to the force, transferred in from another facility a year after Ethan's conviction. Nothing in his record flagged concern. Until now. The room went silent as Agent Lorna Mitchell from the state's Internal Investigation Division entered. She took one look at Max, then turned to Rendell. "We're going to ask you a few questions. Please come with us." Rendell didn't move. Max growled again. Something cracked. Rendell's eyes darted to the door, and before anyone could react, he bolted. Chaos erupted. Two guards tackled him near the hallway, dragging him back into the room. A vial fell from his jacket pocket and shattered on the ground. Gasoline sample swabs. Evidence. Everyone froze. Agent Mitchell crouched down, carefully retrieving a scorched matchbook from his pocket, identical to the one used in the fire that framed Ethan. The air turned to ice. "He kept a trophy," she muttered. "A signature mistake." Ethan stared, mouth open, barely able to speak. "Max, you remembered." Max let out one final bark, a sound full of fury, vindication, and release. In that moment, Ethan wasn't just an inmate with a dying wish. He was a man whose dog had just testified and turned a silent room into a courtroom no one could ignore. The night had started like any other. Ethan Ray had worked a double shift at Station 14, rolling back into his driveway just after midnight. Rain lashed against the windshield as Max sat beside him in the passenger seat, eyes alert, ears twitching at every crack of thunder. They'd done this routine 100 times, home, shower, bed, but something felt off that night. As Ethan stepped onto the porch, Max froze. His muscles tensed, nose lifted, and a low growl escaped his throat. Ethan had always trusted Max's instincts. They'd saved him more than once. So, when the dog refused to step into the house, Ethan paused. "Buddy? What is it?" Max didn't move. Then Ethan smelled it. Faint, but undeniable. Gasoline. Before he could turn fully, the garage door burst open in a violent flash of orange and heat. Flames exploded outward, licking the side of the house and blowing out the nearest windows. The force knocked Ethan off his feet, slamming him into the porch railing. Dazed, ears ringing, Ethan looked up to see Max already scrambling toward the neighbor's home next door, the one where young Josh and his mother lived. The flames were spreading fast, leaping from structure to structure like wildfire in dry brush. Ethan staggered up, but smoke filled his lungs before he could shout a warning. He blacked out moments later. When he came to, paramedics were surrounding him. Firefighters were dragging hoses toward both burning homes. A body bag was being loaded into the ambulance, Josh's mother. Another stretcher was being prepped, Ethan's unconscious neighbor. And Max? Max was at the side of the house, his muzzle blackened, his front paws bleeding, clawing at the garage like he was trying to dig something, or someone, out. Ethan tried to stand. "He saved me," he croaked. "He tried to warn me. He tried..." But no one listened. Detectives were already collecting evidence. One found a half-burned matchbook in Ethan's mailbox. Another noted that Ethan and the neighbor had recently argued over a property line. They called it motive, called the gasoline staged, ignored the timeline, ignored the dog. Max was sedated and removed by animal control, deemed unstable, even though his only aggression had been trying to protect Ethan from being restrained. Ethan's trial was swift. The prosecution leaned on the matchbook, the gasoline scent on his jacket, the strained neighbor relationship. The defense barely called witnesses. And Max? The judge wouldn't even allow mention of the dog's behavior that night. "Irrelevant," he said. But Ethan remembered, and Max never forgot. That was the night his world ended, not from the fire, not from the sentence, but from the silence. Because no one had listened to the only soul who had seen the truth from the very beginning, until now. And in that visitation room, as a corrupt officer was dragged away, it was as if time rewound. One final flash of fire, revealing what had always been buried in the smoke: innocence. While the visitation room swarmed with agents and shaken guards, another scene unfolded quietly, unnoticed down the east wing of Cold River Penitentiary. The prison chaplain, Father Thomas Hale, moved through the corridors with his worn Bible in hand. He had been preparing for Ethan Ray's final rites, pages dog-eared, words practiced, prayers chosen, but now, with news spreading fast about Max's shocking reaction and a guard being dragged off in cuffs, something pulled at him. He knew Ethan, not well, but enough. They'd spoken briefly over the years, mostly about guilt, silence, and faith. Ethan never denied his sorrow over the fire, but he always insisted on one thing: "I didn't set it." That line had never changed. As Father Hale stepped into the prison chapel, he noticed something unusual. Ethan's old property box had been moved from storage and left on a table for final inventory. It was protocol. Every inmate's personal effects were prepared before execution, but the chaplain had always been drawn to what was left behind. He opened the box slowly. A fireman's badge, a family photo, faded, wrinkled at the edges, and then something strange. A worn envelope with no name, just the initials JL scribbled in the corner. Curious, he slipped the envelope from the pile. Inside were several small pages, ripped from a notebook. The handwriting was messy, rushed. He read the first line and froze. "If anything happens to me, tell the truth. Ethan didn't light the fire. I did." The name signed at the bottom made his breath catch. Jake Loring. Jake, Ethan's former crewmate, the neighbor who had testified against him, the same man who had claimed Ethan was angry and unstable in court, and the man whose house had been destroyed by the spreading fire, but who had mysteriously moved across the country just weeks after the trial. Father Hale scanned the pages again. The note detailed guilt, fear, a confession of starting the fire during a drunken argument, then panicking when it spread to the neighboring home. Max's behavior that night, barking, trying to pull Ethan out of the garage, matched what Jake described. The dog had smelled the fumes, had tried to lead Ethan away from the trap. And the matchbook, Jake had planted it in Ethan's mailbox. The chaplain's hands trembled. This wasn't just regret, this was a confession. And it had sat, undiscovered, in a box for years. He bolted from the chapel, papers clutched to his chest, racing through the corridors until he reached the command post outside the visitation room. The moment Agent Mitchell saw the crumpled note, she snatched it, scanned the pages, and turned ghost white. "This is a signed confession," she whispered. The evidence was now undeniable. Ethan Ray had been framed. A corrupted witness, a planted item, and the only one who knew the truth, Max, had been silenced. Until today. And now, with 1 hour left on the clock, that truth had come crashing back through stone walls and steel doors. All because the right person finally listened. The clock on the wall read 11:02 p.m., 58 minutes until Ethan Ray's scheduled execution. Inside Cold River's administrative wing, what had begun as a routine final shift now pulsed with tension. Agent Lorna Mitchell clutched the confession letter from Jake Loring, her knuckles white. On the desk before her, an open laptop displayed a digital copy of Ethan's trial transcript. It was damning, until now. "We need an emergency injunction," she snapped to the state attorney on the line. "This is no longer a question of doubt. It's proof." "But it's after hours," came the shaky reply. "Judges don't..." "Then wake one up," Mitchell shouted. "You want to explain to the press tomorrow how the state executed an innocent man with a signed confession in its hands?" Every second passed like thunder. In the visitation room, Ethan still knelt beside Max. He hadn't been told what was happening, only that the visit had been extended. He glanced up at the wall clock. 11:05. The sound of ticking echoed louder now. He whispered into Max's ear, "This might be our last night together, boy." Max remained pressed to his side, unmoving, unwavering. In the legal office, Father Hale, Warden Brackett, and Margaret all stood behind Mitchell as she fired off faxes, emails, scanned the letter. Every word of Jake's confession highlighted in red. The judge finally responded at 11:17. "Emergency hearing approved," the clerk announced. Via secure video, Judge Lambert presiding. A laptop was propped on a rolling cart in the conference room. The video feed flickered on. Judge Lambert appeared in a dark robe, eyes narrowed. "Make your case." Mitchell didn't hesitate. She laid out everything. Max's alert on Officer Rendell, the gasoline vial, the matchbook, and the handwritten confession found in Ethan's untouched belongings. The camera captured every word. The judge's brow furrowed deeper. This is serious, but extraordinary relief requires extraordinary proof. That dog, Mitchell said, pointing toward the visitation feed where Max remained beside Ethan, is the reason we reopened the room. He barked, he remembered, and that led us to all of this. At 11:36 p.m., the judge leaned forward. I'm issuing an immediate stay of execution pending full investigation. No lethal injection, no further action. Clear? Mitchell exhaled. Clear. Brackett wiped his face with a trembling hand. Back in the holding corridor, Ethan had been escorted halfway toward the prep chamber. His chains clinked softly with each step. But before the final door opened, a guard sprinted down the hall, waving a document. Stop! Stay granted. He's not going anywhere. Ethan turned sharply. What? The guard smiled, barely. You're not dying tonight. Silence followed, and then a bark. From behind him, Max barked once, sharp, proud, as if to say, I told you so. The hallway erupted into quiet relief, but no one cried harder than Margaret, and Ethan, who fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around the only soul who had fought for his life from the very beginning. They hadn't just beaten the clock, they'd beaten injustice. By the next morning, the world knew. It began with a single photo, snapped by a guard who, against protocol, had captured the moment Ethan knelt beside Max in the visitation room, their foreheads pressed together, surrounded by silence and chains. The image leaked onto social media at 6:43 a.m. Within minutes, it was viral. The dog knew, justice for Ethan, Max saved him news anchors scrambled. By 9 a.m., every major network was broadcasting breaking segments. Death Row Dog Saves Innocent Man scrolled across screens from New York to Tokyo. Clips played of Max's stare down with Officer Rendell. Rumors circulated about the confession letter. People cried, gasped, and demanded answers. One station aired an old interview from Ethan's trial, where he said, Max tried to warn me. He knew something was wrong. The footage, long buried, now played on repeat, alongside headlines that read, Convicted firefighter freed, was innocent all along. Outside Cold River Penitentiary, protesters gathered, not with signs of anger, but with candles, dog treats, and homemade posters that read, Give Max a medal and let him go home. By noon, civil rights attorneys were demanding a full investigation into the original case. How did the confession remain buried? Why hadn't the evidence been properly followed? And more urgently, how many more innocent people were silenced? But amid the storm of fury and questions, something else was happening. Hope. Max, now dubbed the witness dog, became a symbol not just of loyalty, but of intuition, of the idea that justice doesn't always wear a badge or sit on a bench. Sometimes it growls, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it remembers. A crowd-funded campaign raised over $400,000 within 24 hours for Ethan's legal reintegration, Max's long-term care, and a nonprofit for wrongly accused inmates. People wrote songs, painted murals, and sent letters to Ethan, thousands of them. Some came from children who wrote, I want to be like Max when I grow up. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in a secured hospital suite, recovering from shock and exhaustion. He hadn't spoken to the press, not yet. His only request was to be left alone with Max. I want to give him steak, he said quietly. For the first time in years. The good kind, the one he used to love. The media respected the silence, for now. But pressure grew on the state governor. Demands for immediate pardon were rising. Journalists dug into Officer Rendell's past and found disciplinary records, hidden plea deals, and several instances of tampered evidence in unrelated cases. Everything was unraveling, all because one dog wouldn't sit quietly. In a society built on rules and reason, Max had reminded everyone of something far deeper. Instinct, loyalty, and the kind of truth that doesn't need to be spoken to be believed. The world watched a man nearly die for a crime he didn't commit. But what stunned everyone more was that his dog never gave up on him. 3 days after the stay of execution, the courtroom lights flickered on just after sunrise. The courthouse had opened early for an emergency evidentiary hearing, an unprecedented move prompted by the explosive events at Cold River Penitentiary. Word of the confession, the corrupt officer, and the dog's startling reaction had triggered national outrage. And now, the pressure to overturn Ethan Ray's conviction had reached critical mass. The courtroom was packed. Every bench held attorneys, reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens who had followed the story. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but dozens of journalists scribbled furiously as Ethan was led into the chamber, this time without shackles. He wore a plain white shirt, his hair slightly overgrown, his face thinner than it had been years ago. But he walked with quiet resolve, and beside him, on a leash held by Margaret, walked Max. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Haynes, banged her gavel. This court is now in session. We are here to consider new evidence pertaining to State versus Ethan Ray, originally adjudicated 8 years ago. The state's representative attempted a weak defense. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the new material, we believe further investigation is warranted before any hasty reversal. Judge Haynes raised her hand. A signed confession, a piece of physical evidence tied to the original fire, and a law enforcement officer found in possession of contraband? That's not hasty, that's overwhelming. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Then Agent Lorna Mitchell approached the bench, sliding forward the confession letter along with sworn statements from Officer Rendell's locker search. We also have digital proof that Jake Loring purchased 2 gasoline canisters hours before the fire, despite claiming in court he was asleep all night. Ethan didn't speak. He kept his hand gently resting on Max's back. Margaret approached next. Your Honor, this dog's behavior isn't just emotional, he's trained. His alert in the visitation room led directly to the discovery of suppressed evidence. Without Max, this man would have died. Judge Haynes nodded slowly. Sometimes the best testimony doesn't come from a person. A soft murmur of agreement spread across the room. Finally, Father Hale stood, reading a written statement from Ethan. I don't want revenge. I want the truth on record for Max. He never stopped trying to protect me, even when the whole world forgot. Silence followed. Judge Haynes glanced down, shuffled a few papers, and sighed. This court finds the original conviction unsafe, unreliable, and unsupported by the full facts. Effective immediately, the charges against Ethan Ray are vacated. He is a free man. Applause erupted. Some wept. Others simply stood in stunned silence. Ethan dropped to one knee beside Max, pulling him into his arms. We did it, buddy, he whispered. We made it. The courtroom doors opened as they stepped out into a world that had turned upside down. But Ethan wasn't broken. Max wasn't forgotten. And justice, real, raw, and undeniable, had finally barked back. Freedom, Ethan quickly learned, didn't come with silence. It came with sound. The sound of wind against his skin without fences. The sound of a dog's paws across wooden floors. The sound of strangers stopping in the street to shake his hand or ask if they could pet Max. After nearly a decade behind bars, the noise of life was overwhelming and beautiful. His first morning outside prison walls, Ethan woke in a guest room at Margaret's ranch. Max curled beside the bed, breathing slow and deep. No metal clanks, no buzzers, just sunrise and soft breathing. Ethan walked barefoot into the kitchen. Margaret had left coffee brewing and a note. Take your time. Let the world catch up to you. And the world was catching up. Requests poured in from media outlets, offers for book deals, documentaries, interviews, but Ethan declined them all, at least for now. This isn't a story about me, he said. It's about what happens when no one listens to the right voice. He spent his days quietly, helping Margaret around the ranch, fixing fences, rebuilding kennels, feeding rescue dogs. Max was always nearby, shadowing his every step, never straying too far. The dog who once clawed through fire now slept peacefully in the grass under wide blue skies. One afternoon, Ethan was invited to speak at a local elementary school. At first, he hesitated. What would I say to kids? He asked Margaret. She smiled. Tell them the truth, about loyalty, about listening, about not giving up. So he went. He stood in front of third graders who had drawn pictures of Max, who'd written cards that said things like, "You're a hero," and "Max is the bravest dog ever." Ethan read them one by one. Then he knelt down beside Max, who sat proudly, ears high. "This is Max," Ethan said softly. "He saved me, not with words, but with what he remembered. He waited, and he didn't let go. A little girl raised her hand. "How did he know you didn't do it?" Ethan smiled. "Because dogs don't care about rumors or mistakes. They know what's in your heart." Max remembered who I was, even when I forgot. The room fell quiet, and in that stillness, the impact landed. He wasn't just a man who escaped death. He was someone reborn, not bitter, but better. Back at the ranch, Ethan built a small cabin on the far edge of the property. Nothing fancy, just wood, space, and peace. He named it Redemption's Edge. Max had his own bed, but most nights he still curled up beside Ethan's feet. Some evenings they sat outside under the stars. Ethan would sip coffee, and Max would rest his head on Ethan's knee. No fences, no chains, just the two of them. The world had moved fast, but here they had time again. Because in the end, what saved Ethan Ray wasn't evidence or lawyers. It was a dog's unwavering love, and a second chance that came right on time. The auditorium was packed, yet still, it was silent. Rows of soldiers, firefighters, first responders, and civilians filled the Coldridge Civic Hall as the mayor stood at the podium. Cameras rolled, children clutched little stuffed German Shepherd toys. Reporters whispered updates into microphones. And at the center of it all, wearing a custom-made service vest with silver trim, stood Max. The mayor cleared his throat. "Today, we honor a hero. Not in uniform, not with a badge, but with something rarer: instinct, loyalty, and heart." Applause erupted. Ethan sat in the front row, adjusting his tie awkwardly. He still wasn't used to attention. His eyes rarely left Max, who sat stoically on a raised platform like he knew the moment was for him. The mayor continued. When Ethan Ray was wrongly convicted, it was Max who never gave up. He remembered the truth. He led investigators to hidden evidence. And in doing so, he didn't just save a life, he restored justice. The crowd rose to their feet as a military color guard stepped forward with a velvet-lined box. Inside was a custom-forged Medal of Valor for civilian K-9 service, a rarely given honor, typically reserved for dogs in war or national emergencies. Margaret, standing beside Ethan, whispered, "Only 3 dogs in history have received this medal." Ethan swallowed hard. The mayor stepped down and approached Max, who tilted his head curiously. The medal was placed gently around his neck, hanging against his vest. Then, almost as if on cue, Max barked once, loud and proud. The hall shook with applause. Ethan stepped forward and crouched beside him. "You deserve this more than anyone," he murmured. "You saved me, more than once." The event wasn't just about symbolism. It was about what Max had come to represent: resilience, memory, and justice that can't be silenced. After the ceremony, reporters crowded outside the hall. "Ethan, what are your next steps?" one asked. He smiled, glancing at Max. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. I don't need big plans. I've already been given the only thing that matters: a second chance and someone who believed in me." Later that afternoon, a new bronze statue was unveiled in the Coldridge City Square. It was simple: a German Shepherd sitting tall, ears alert, eyes forward. At the base, a plaque read, "In honor of Max, who spoke without words and saved without fear." Loyalty never lies. Children placed flowers and stuffed toys at the base. Some locals said they'd never seen anything like it. A town transformed not by politics or power, but by a dog who waited years for justice and barked at just the right time. That night, under a sky lit by stars and flashbulbs, Max didn't act any different. He curled up in the back seat of the truck, his head resting on Ethan's leg. Medal or not, all he ever wanted was to be beside his person. And now, he finally was. The sun was just beginning to rise when Ethan laced his boots, opened the front door, and whistled softly. Max stirred from the porch, where he had been resting, eyes half closed, already awake before Ethan called. He rose slowly, joints a bit stiffer now, but spirit unshaken. His tail wagged once, steady and calm, as he padded down the steps and fell into step beside the man he had waited years to save. They walked without speaking, no destination, no plan, just the trail through the woods behind the ranch. Trees stretched tall above them, golden light breaking through the canopy. Birds stirred, and the air carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. Max sniffed it all with quiet reverence, pausing now and then to listen. Ethan reached down every few steps, running his fingers through Max's fur. "You remember this trail?" he asked softly. "We used to come here before." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Max already knew. This was the place they had walked before the fire, before the accusations, before the cell doors. It was a loop, 3 miles through woods, a bend by the stream, and back around the fields. They used to run it. Now, they strolled it slowly. At the halfway point, Ethan sat on a large rock by the stream. Max lay beside him, his head on Ethan's boot. Water trickled nearby, peaceful and clear. For a long time, they just stayed there, no words between them, just breath and heartbeat. Ethan pulled a folded letter from his coat. He'd written it the night before, not for the world, not for the media, just for Max. "You never gave up on me. When the world forgot me, you remembered. When I lost hope, you held on. You saved my life, not just once, but every day you waited. I'm free because of you, and I will never let you go again." He folded it again and slid it back into his coat pocket. Max looked up, and Ethan chuckled. "I know, buddy. Mushy stuff, huh?" They started back slowly. The walk took longer this time. Max didn't rush. He stopped to smell every tree, paused at every turn. It was as if he knew this wasn't just a walk, it was a closing chapter. Back at the cabin, Ethan fixed breakfast, eggs, toast, and a thick steak just for Max. The old dog ate every bite with joy, licking the plate clean, tail thumping softly on the floor. Later that evening, as the sky turned amber, Max curled beside the fireplace, breathing deep, his head on Ethan's foot. Ethan sat quietly, reading a book, occasionally glancing down. And when Max finally drifted into sleep, his breathing light, eyes closing for what might be the last time, Ethan didn't cry. He leaned forward, kissed his head gently, and whispered, "You did everything you were ever meant to do." And in that moment, a chapter closed, not in grief, but in peace. Because some bonds don't end, they simply become eternal.